All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Laugesen, and I'm the interim director for the UCLA Tarjan Center, which is a university center for excellence in developmental disabilities. And on behalf of the Tarjan Center faculty and staff, and also our co-sponsors, who include the UCLA Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Center, also known as the IDDRC, and the UCLA Center for Autism Research and Treatment, also known as CART. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our distinguished lecture series and to also welcome our distinguished speaker, Elissa Kaustinen. Now, by way of background, Elissa comes to us from the Thompson Autism Center at Children's Health of Orange County, where she's the director of FAST, which stands for Families and Students Together, and is affiliated with the Chapman University's Thompson Policy Institute. Now, while Elissa's primary role as the director of FAST is to provide education consultation with families, agencies, and schools, she is also involved in developing a transition program to support patients at the Thompson Autism Center as they transition into adulthood through person-driven planning. Now, in addition to her clinical and administrative responsibilities, Elissa is also a collaborator on a really interesting study using virtual reality to train individuals with disabilities on how to interact with first responders. I definitely want to hear more about that, Elissa. That sounds really innovative. Prior to joining the Thompson Policy Institute at Chapman University, Elissa obtained her master's degree in school psychology from Alliant University in San Francisco. She has a PPS credential and administrative credential, and she worked within the public school system for 17 years, which included 7 years as a school psychologist and 10 years as an administrator within special education. Now, Elissa is very passionate about supporting individuals with disabilities and navigating services and promoting a culture of inclusivity. So today, Elissa will be presenting her important insights on creating collaborative relationships with families, agencies, and schools. Now, we encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A feature on the Zoom toolbar, and Dr. Jasper Estebillo, our Director of Training, will be moderating those questions at the end of the talk. Also, if you're interested in using the closed captioning, you can use the live transcript feature on the Zoom toolbar, and there's also a link in the chat if you want to directly link to the closed captioning. In the meantime, without further ado, please join me in giving me a warm virtual welcome to Elissa Kaustinen.
Thank you, Dr. Laugesen. I'm very excited to be here today and to present to you. So I'm going to start my presentation. Okay. So we're going to kind of talk about creating collaborative relationships with families, agencies, and schools. And the learning objectives for today is I'd like everyone to walk away with on how to create and sustain collaborative partnerships, and also look and identify ways to leverage partnerships to support individuals with disabilities and family outcomes. So I know Dr. Laugesen introduced me, but a little bit about myself. I did spend 17 years within the public school system. So I worked as a school psychologist, assessing and supporting individuals with disability, and then moved into administration. And while I was in special education administration, I built numerous programs for students, helped create, more inclusive practices, supported co-teaching, and really disbanding our mild moderate classes within the special education system in the school districts I worked in, and how could we really create inclusive environments. I do have a huge passion for transition services and really helping individuals transition from childhood to kind of into that adulthood and being able to access what they'd like to sustain for their lifelong dreams. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about why. Why are we going to build an innovative model? Why do we look at collaborating a little bit different? The future design a program through our FAST model, so integrating the medical and education models together, removing those barriers, and supported shared responsibilities. We're also going to talk about an app that we are utilizing over at the Thompson Autism Center at Chalk, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A. And so before we get started, this CAT scale is one I've seen in a presentation and I've always enjoyed it. But I like in the chat box, if you can, for a brief moment, look at which cat do you feel like when walking into an IEP meeting or a medical appointment. And so for me, I know that depending on the day, depending on what meeting it is, or what kind of an appointment it is, I can feel various emotions. And so when I know it's a positive meeting and when I get to go in and talk about transitions and how we're supporting individuals, I'll feel like a number 8, exciting, looking at the future, just that hopefulness. And so if you want to just take a minute and type in the chat box what cat you feel like when you think about IEP meetings or, walking into that medical appointment, it'd be great.
I think the chat's disabled for our attendees, but maybe they could use the Q&A feature on the toolbar.
I actually am starting to see some come in. A number 6, definitely a lot of 6s, some 9s. I have been there in those IEP meetings where I feel like a 9 too. So 6 and 9, great. Those are great pieces. And I think the goal in this, when we look at collaboration, is we do want to change that, kind of switch that cat scale into an 8, where it can be exciting and hopeful and not necessarily something you dread. So one of the main pieces, I think, as an educator and as my new role at the Thompson Autism Center, I'll read this statement from a parent. It's comments I get frequently. So kind of the why. I get anxious before every IEP meeting. My stomach starts churning. I have difficulties concentrating and my heart flutters. It has been nearly a decade. While some meetings have gotten a little easier, I still get nervous. It feels like my child's future is hanging in the balance every year. Whether it's true or not, that's how I feel. Everyone else in the room will be a professional educator, and I'm the only one there who must live with the outcome of the decisions made during the meeting. Even when I know his team cares about my child, it can be a heavy, lonely burden. And so this was an email I received from a parent regarding just the IEP process and kind of our consultation. So many parents feel this way, have that anxiety, get so anxious about it, when a lot of the educators I know, they're not there necessarily wanting to invoke that feeling. And so when we look at this, it's really because we use a traditional model, or typical traditional model in schools, I'd say, and even the medical community, is you have the family at the center, and they're the ones who are communicating directly with the private providers. So it could be the medical doctors, it could be the ABA providers, regional center, and then the opposite end, you have the school. And each agency, the school district, has their own way of becoming eligible, the diagnosis, trying to navigate all those roads. And then all of these providers have those goals. So they have goals that they're targeting. And the number one thing is that there's not that communication, there's not that bridge to bring it together. And I know from being in schools and from being in the kind of the medical community now, that the desire of each party is not necessarily to be in that isolation, but obviously there's time and there's not necessarily that collaboration. And so when we look at the traditional model, schools and private providers are working in isolation. Parents are responsible for that communicating between groups. There's the confusion between diagnosis and special education eligibility, and not necessarily understanding why they qualify for a diagnosis, but didn't necessarily meet the same criteria for an IEP. They also don't necessarily have targets that are similar. And so there's not a shared target. The other piece is that there's a lack of understanding on each provider's role. And so when you have a family who's trying to navigate so much for their child and truly wanting to be able to provide their child with the best support, that understanding of who does what and that confusion can be great. Also the lack of collaboration. And so when we look at those individual goals, sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't, sometimes they're in conflict of one another. And then also looking at being able to differentiate between the long-term and short-term goals. Services sometimes are not complementary, nor is it understanding of why my medical provider is doing one-on-one and the school's mainly providing group. But being able to understand kind of the flow of it and why. I think that why and that communication of that understanding. Many of the experts are working in isolation. And then also, I think the input of working outside of your field. So and that knowledge of it. So there are at times when experts in the field will make recommendations in areas that they're not necessarily expert in. So looking at that time to try to come together and bring that collaboration in. And I think often with the traditional models, many times families are confused, individuals are confused. I'd even say sometimes the medical providers are confused, as well as, the school team. So I'd say across the board, there's a lot of confusion as to why are they recommending this? Why are they offering this? And really taking a look at trying to clear up that confusion and help create a steady path. And so really, when we look at an innovation approach, we have our families, our private providers, and our schools with similar goals. So all of them are looking at collaborating together. And so it's a cohesive piece of working together and really supporting one another. When we look at what our goal is looking at the schools and private providers are working in collaboration, that there is a team approach for communicating between the groups. There's an explanation of roles. And so understanding what each member's role is. And sometimes it's not necessarily clear just by their title, because there are people who may hold multiple roles, may look at providing supports in multiple areas. And so there's that explanation of roles. And then there's also this shared responsibility of the students' targets. And so looking at everyone is held responsible and accountable for that shared support. When we look at the benefits of this approach, we see that the collaborative network that includes the families, the agencies, and schools, that there's a positive relationship focused on targeted outcomes. It looks at removing those barriers to services and complementing one another, and really being able to maximize those resources. So when we look at building this innovative approach, there's a team. So it is a team approach. Just like one of the important things I think that I love about the Thompson Autism Center is we use a team approach in all that we're doing. So when you come to our center and there's a medical appointment, you're with our neurologist, you're with our psychologist, you've got our resource specialist there. I'm also there supporting schools, and we'll kind of get into that role, but really feeling like there's a team approach and everyone is on the same page. Building, sustaining that collaboration, trusting each other, but also understanding the very differences between the medical model and the educational model, which are two very different types of models, both very important on their own, but also there's different processes and there's different pieces in both. And I know for families, especially with the families in my role that I work with, this can be a piece where, it needs to be broken down a couple different times, because necessarily what you need for one, it's a little bit different for the other. And so when we look at developing the team, there's a team leader. And so at school, it can be the case carrier. Sometimes parents like to take that active role. Over at our center, I'll also take that after role. But being able to identify and have a list of all of the private providers. So if you have multiple speech, ABA, OT privately through your insurance, as well as the educational service providers, really being able to write down and understand as a parent those information, or even if you're coming from the school team, or even say the medical team, is understanding who are the players that you're working with, getting signed releases of information. Very important to have those current releases so they can exchange that information and support one another. One of the pieces I think that is so important is to relay the areas of your expertise. And so when I personally reach out to a school team, I let them know my areas of expertise and what my role is with our team. It's really to support and foster that communication and build more collaboration, not necessarily build division, not to divide, but really to bring together. And so that's really identifying your area of expertise. And in that, sometimes that area of expertise changes a little bit. So for example, when I'm a part of a team, and I'm going in there to help a family navigate and understand the IEP process, versus when I'm a part of a team and my focus is transition. My area, I have the knowledge of both, but my area and the role that I'm going to play within that team is going to vary a little bit, but also clarifying those roles of being able to understand when that role is appropriate and when it's not necessarily appropriate. When building collaboration, encourage communication prior to a meeting. Ensure all parties are represented at the IEP. Set the norms at the beginning of a meeting. When we do look at the representation of the IEP, my role as the FAST director over at the Thompson Autism Center, I bring the information from our neurologist, from our clinical psychologist, from our BCBA who are working directly with the patient. And that's because necessarily everyone may not be able to join the IEP at that time, but my role at our center is going to be to represent those parties and have their information. And if I don't necessarily have that information, be able to go back and ask those questions. Really try to utilize collaborative language and really look at considering person-centered planning. And if you're not necessarily familiar with person-centered planning, I suggest to kind of become familiar, because really it allows the individual to look at what do they want for their future? What do they see they're wanting from school? How can they advocate? How can they build and sustain those things? And where do they need support? What are some of those weaknesses that we want to look at stepping in side by side and looking at helping them through those pieces to where they can overcome some of their weaknesses? Or maybe it's looking at those coping skills to be able to discuss it, or it's looking at what are your ideals for your education for post-secondary, and how can we come in as a team and really collaborate. And I also suggest using strength-based language. I think it's ideal when not only families can participate in IEP meetings and medical appointments, but also have the patients, that individual with a disability, so they understand what's going on and they can really, in a strength way, because there's so many amazing things. Yes, everybody's got weaknesses, but those strengths, if we can really build up those strengths and use strength-based language, it can only help kind of push forward success in that collaboration. Also, in order to sustain the collaboration, bring it back the discussion to long-term goals for the person. Refrain from the blame game. I can tell you, from working in a school district, oftentimes as a district personnel, I was hesitant to bring in some outside agencies because of the blame game. And so one of my pieces is really look at how can we support and move forward and not necessarily sit in this area of conflict, but what can we do to avoid blaming each other, but keep that individual as the focus. And that's when you really go back to those agreed upon norms. And then just really revisit the medical model versus that educational model. Go back to what is the role of each kind of person, facility. And so what I will quickly just touch on is looking at that medical model versus the education model. When we look at the medical model, we're following the DSM-5, medical diagnosis, treatment, therapy, which is going to address the condition. You know, you're looking at working with medical professionals and it's in a clinical setting. And you're really kind of looking at also, I'd say, navigating with insurances. And so medical providers will kind of give you that treatment plan. The educational eligibility, and one of the pieces that I do try to remind families is that just because we get a diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be education eligibility, that the school district does not look at does not diagnose. They're only looking at ed code with the eligibility. And one of the main pieces is looking at that educational impact and benefit. And so they utilize a multidisciplinary team comprised of teachers, a school psychologist, administrators, and whatever therapist that may be appropriate. And it's really looking at that school setting. And so they're really very two different, but also both play an important role together, because there are going to be some overlaps in supporting individuals and families. And so some of the pieces that we look at for improved collaboration And this can be done at school as well as at home. But looking at home, creating a meet my child or about my child sheet. And so if this type of form can be filled with any school, medical provider, new babysitter, family members, and takes a look at the strengths of their child, but also maybe some of those things where they may not know how your child communicates. They may not know how your child indicates that I'm uncomfortable, this isn't going well, or I'm excited, I am happy. So looking at those types of pieces. I'd also say at home with parents looking at getting assigned releases with all service providers. Typically with service providers, and I feel like it's one of the areas everyone likes to have their own signed release. And so the doctor's office, the ABA agency, regional center will want to release, as well as the school district will want to release on their documentation. And so if a family can take that initiative and get those releases, normally when a family does sign a release for me, what I'll do as kind of that leader is I will reach out to the school and say, here's my release of information. I know typically you also like to have it on your own documentation. Can you please send it to the parents? And so I give them a heads up that the parents are going to be wanting this or needing this. Also, it's a great idea to do an introductory email with all providers and letting them know with the releases attached that, we're one team. We're really looking at wanting to collaborate and wanting to move forward with the same goal in mind. With the school, really being able to introduce yourself at the beginning of the year, also creating what to expect this year, kind of like a fact sheet. So the IEP month, looking at progress reporting areas, looking at your contact information, the teacher's contact information. So if you're in secondary, there are typically multiple teachers. So if it does become a little more complicated, parents have that information right up front. Consider inviting the parent in for an informal get to know you meeting. And so not just necessarily have that touch point of, the IEP or when a parent requests an IEP, but throughout the year, at the beginning of the year, letting them know this is who I am, this is how I can support. And also really contacting those private providers before that IEP to help develop rapport and also understand what are those targeted goals they're working on and sharing that knowledge and information. And so really what I'm going to dive into next is looking at the specific program that I run is called Families, Agencies, and Schools Together. And then the next program I will touch on, it's an app called Undivided. And really it's something we're piloting right now at the Thompson Autism Center to look at how these different approaches can really help support our families, because that's the main goal is they understand how to navigate the system and they feel like they've got a partner walking through it with them, because it can be so isolating and so alone. So looking at the FAST agency and Families, Agencies, and Schools Together program, the FAST program really, was developed to help families improve the quality programming, improve educational outcomes for students with neurodevelopmental disorders. It really is the main purpose is to build a collaborative relationship between all of the agencies with schools to support the individuals and their families. Provide educational workshop, small group consultation, individual consultation to really navigate the special education system within the school. And also finally, it is also to educate, I'd say, the medical providers on the school system, because often or not, and if you've worked in a school, you've seen those prescriptions of saying, so-and-so needs a one-on-one aid and that's it. And so it's really trying to help medical providers understand what is the information that they can come and they can give to schools that is beneficial and help them with their educational programming. And so when we look at our FAST history, it was originally created from Dr. Don Cardinal out of Chapman University in 2012. And so he kind of created this idea and was asked if you could help navigate the school system, what do you think it would be? What would make a great impact? And he said, really, honestly, is the collaboration. It's a collaboration where families and the agencies and schools work together versus kind of in opposition. Clear up those miscommunications, because a lot of times when families are in opposition with the school district, it's because they don't understand what is being communicated or the school's not communicating it. And so the doors opened in 2013 at the first FAST, and that was at the UCI Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorders. And so that site has been there since 2013. And kind of in 2016, it really moved into multi-tiered systems of support. And so those supports, they then began doing IEEs, so independent educational evaluations there, also supporting transition, so helping individuals transition into adulthood, offering not only those trainings, but the individual and group consultations. And then in 2020 is when the expansion of FAST came to the Thompson Autism Center at Chalk. And that's kind of, I was fortunate enough to be asked to be the FAST director over at the Thompson Autism Center. And it kind of helped it expand and grow. And then in 2020, January, we actually officially changed our name to reflect really the model and where our services are going. Where before it was really focused on families and schools being together, is that one of the pieces that we didn't really highlight throughout their time, but we were doing was supporting the agencies, was having that ongoing consultation as well as trainings for agencies, for medical providers. And so when we look at it, currently kind of what our FAST consultation is that we do our consultation with families, schools, clinical and medical professionals. We do education for parents, schools, clinical and medical professionals, and then we do assessments. And so right now at the Thompson Autism Center, we are not doing independent education evaluations just yet because we're still growing into that. However, over at UCI Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorder with Dr. Carrier, she has been doing them for several years now. And so when we look at the families, agencies, and schools together with our families, what we do is we really hold workshops called Success in Special Education. We've got our beginning and our advanced IEP navigation. And that's really understanding just the IEP. Many times you can read an IEP and have questions and then actually go back to the IEP and have your questions answered. So a lot of times I work with family on how do you read this document that you were given and really truly understand it. We also do Autism 101. We also do problem solving consultations. And so we look at doing individual consultations, document review and explanation, IEP meeting preparation. So kind of that prep, the IEP team collaboration, and then over at the Center for Autism, the CAN, and then transition. Thus far since 2013, we've served around 1,500 families in this process. And then when we look at our agencies, we've done professional development with UCI and Chalk residencies. So they do rotations and grand rounds. We offer education consultation on cases and then do collaborative appointments. And those are those co-occurring appointments where I'm sitting in there with a neurologist, our clinical psychologist, and helping families kind of navigate and understand. And sometimes it is going back to ask the school for something, but also having that data, not just making the request, but understanding that the why and the data. So making data-driven decisions. The other thing is we do training workshops focused on access and understanding, developmental screenings, consultation, and collaborative events. So we'll hold resource fairs and really try to make it more of a collaborative approach and be a part of a lot of county teams and groups into supporting, the families and also the greater Orange County. And so with this, we've done over between UCI Center for Autism and the Thompson Autism Center, we've had over 600 medical and clinical collaborations between providers since 2016. And then when we look at schools, we have training workshops. And so there's the Autism Diagnostic Observation System, so the ADOS-2. And our ADOS training, Dr. Carrier is the one who does oversee that training and will go out and conduct the trainings. There's also refresher courses. We also will do conducting a comprehensive school-based autism evaluation for schools, also building positive relationships for parents, how to support students within the with ASD within the general education classroom. We also have done community advisory committee presentations, case consultation. There's also been program consultation, also IEP team collaborations, and then obviously the educational assessments that are done over at the Center for Autism. And so we've collaborated within Orange County, and I'd say outside of Orange County, with 57 different school districts, and has really looked at supporting students. Over about 1,800 educators have been trained through all of this. And so the other piece that we'll touch on is looking at Undivided. And so Undivided is an app that the Thompson Autism Center currently is piloting with some of our families. We have 25 families who are currently going through this pilot. And the app helps family navigate the systems of supports that are already there. And so complements those with the support of a navigator and a parent community. This support is really, it's wrapped up in with a mobile application, and also can act as a personal health record. And so it's something where it can hold the IEP as well as all the health information. So really being able to try to give families one point of access. And so looking at the centralized platform, they're able to share and manage documents and information from anywhere, get access to different experts and staff members, identify, track, and complete family goals. And really they work at, they partner each family with a navigator kind of each step of the way. And so a parent does feel like they have that support throughout kind of this process. With this, they also can share this information with their medical team, with any agencies they're working on, as well as with the school team. And so the parent is the one who kind of controls that access and who can have access to this information. Really what this is to look at families can create a IEP binder, a medical binder. And I have had families where they come in with these thick binders and, shifting through, finding it, but it can replace that into digital binders. And so families would have to upload the information, and then they would kind of on their phone, they would have access to the medical records, the school information, therapy. And so any information that a parent wanted to kind of document and keep track of and be able to find easily, they can do that. And then they can share, the families can share their binder with anyone on a care team. So anybody that is working with that family can actually access this. However, the parent does have to be the one to invite them on it. So even with our pilot over at the Thompson Autism Center with this, the families have to invite us to access it. But it's great because you can be in a doctor's appointment and say it's a new doctor's, and especially as our center's new and we're getting new patients, they do have a history with someone else, and they do have a history with another neurologist. And so being able to access what medications have been tried and what were those side effects, parents are able to access it kind of with a click of a button on an app. They do events. And so with Undivided, they will reach out and they've got the latest news from different industry experts. It's a place where you can also come in and ask questions, learn from other parents. Many of their navigators are actually parents themselves of individuals who have a disability. And so they come from various backgrounds, and our families can relate to them for what we're seeing. We're seeing our families really benefit from that relationship and that understanding, and someone able to be that sounding board. But parents are then able to become kind of an informed advocate for their child in the various areas. Because with Undivided, what's nice is it's not just necessarily the school piece, but it can help them navigate regional center services or insurance services or Medi-Cal. And so they do have a team that can support in those areas. It is goal-oriented and really helps to identify what the family's goals are for their child and what their priorities are. And so they can follow and create a step-by-step guide to really accomplish those goals. So for example, it's not necessarily, sometimes the goals are outside of it. And I want my child to be able to go hiking with us, or I want to be able to go grocery shopping with my child. And so the experts partner with the family to really look at breaking it down and be able to achieve it. And so on some of these pieces, it may also be that the ABA company that's privately working with their family is also working on the same piece, and they can partner together in the steps and the breakdowns of it. With the navigators, and looking at my time, I actually do have time, so I will play this video just a minute, is that they're there to support you at every turn. And so you can reach out and kind of get that. You can message them through a messaging app, and really have those calls to really support you. I'll go ahead and play this video.
Well, Undivided to us is a community for parents of kids with special needs. It's a one-stop shop of support.
When you've got a child with disabilities, you quickly realize that your life is just taken up by so many different factors. And Undivided is my partner in all of that.
They can help with education, they can help with health insurance, regional center,
IHSS, self-determination, even helping us with IEP goals.
It's so helpful to have one place that you can go to get many answers.
I wish I had something like Undivided when I first had my kids. Navigating the world of disabilities is so intimidating.
The most meaningful part of being a care navigator is the work that I get to do with amazing parents that inspire me and get to see them grow and learn and become empowered.
If I can help them check just one thing off that never-ending list that we have for our kids, I consider that also a personal victory, because I know how it feels when I get to do the same for my kids.
Our care navigator kind of functions like a coach. She is literally the person I can go to anytime a topic comes up that I don't know anything about.
She's been just a fountain of knowledge and support for us over the years, figuring out different strategies to help him develop to his full potential.
She is a lovely person, but she also is excited for us and there with us when things are difficult. She's always there to offer advice and to give encouragement, which is always so appreciated.
Honestly, it's just been a huge lift off of our plate, and it's more than I could have ever asked for.
Sorry about that. So when we look at kind of all that we have going on at our Thompson Autism Center, I think one of the main pieces that I'd like you guys to walk away with here is that looking at how to really collaborate among all the various agencies with families, and how to support families and the medical providers and the school to work collaboratively together. Because what we can do when we want to really help an individual and a family succeed is when we talk and we collaborate together. And so necessarily it's not that needing to do an app or needing to have a FAST program, but that families and even the schools can really help try to navigate this system with even just that specific program. And so hopefully you have gotten some takeaways and some questions regarding this, because I think the way to really help individuals succeed, and I'd say even transition into a meaningful adulthood and accessing what they'd like for their future, is really to be able to collaborate and have that village. And so not necessarily go back to that isolation where the family's having to try to navigate by themselves, but to where the families feel like they have that support and they have the collaboration, and they can get their team members, in a sense, to work together with shared common goals. And so here is my contact information. I do have that up here. This is my Chapman email. If you'd like to learn more about our model at Chapman, it is on the website. But also, we do have a great model over at the Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorder. And the Thompson Policy Institute has been great with support with this, and really trying to be innovative on ways that we can collaborate in a comfortable, safe environment between all shared parties. So I'm going to go ahead can stop sharing my screen. I don't know if there's any questions.
Hi, Elissa. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and sharing these two great resources to the Tarjan community. I think that this is very much a part of all of the individuals that we work with's lives. And I can say that as a clinician who is on that medical side of things, it does feel like there's oftentimes that disjoint in trying to understand and helping parents navigate this process that I oftentimes feel very separate from. So it's wonderful to know that at CHOC that there is just a center through FAST that is able to provide that consultation and support for families.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll start things off with some kind of broader questions as our attendees type their questions into the Q&A. I'm seeing some that number kind of creeping up right now, which is great. But I think, Elissa, what would be helpful for our attendees, you know, whether we are professionals in the field or family members of an individual who is a student in our school districts, can you briefly tell us kind of how to navigate this process? So if I am a clinician and I have a family, how do I refer them to FAST and kind of get this process going?
Well, so as a clinician, I receive actually referrals in a couple different ways. Sometimes it's via email. Within our center, I actually have a FAST referral on our medical Cerner program. And so they send me kind of just like you would have a referral to an x-ray. I get it. So internally, I'll get it through kind of the medical records, and they'll make a referral to me. And some of the main questions that I do request to have answered is kind of is there a timeline? So does the family need to be called today? You know, do I have a week? Is it 2 weeks, or is it just looking at, you know, no rush, I guess you could say. The next one is what are we looking for? Are we looking for a consultation? Are we looking for training? Do we want them to attend a workshop? And then kind of there can be a space for a little more specific. So I also at the Thompson Autism Center, I run social skills groups, and we have our journey transition program. So those are kind of some specific referrals they'll put in for. Like I'm looking for a family for an education consultation, or I'm just looking for you to take a look at this IEP. So an IEP review. So kind of what is the intention of it? And then sometimes what is the desired outcome? So what outcome are you looking for? And then based off of that information, and sometimes there's kind of I'd like a little bit more. So, you know, this is a 5-year-old transitioning to kindergarten. They need support in navigating their transition IEP. So if there are some key highlights, it's great. And then what I end up doing is we do kind of an intake with a family. So I'll reach out to the family and I'll say, what's the concern? You know, what is your concern? I have what our medical provider's concern is, but I'd like to hear from you. Depending on what it is, you know, sometimes with families, I'd say through the pandemic, a lot of it was I want an aid. How do I navigate an aid? And so we'd have a conversation regarding that request. Sometimes I would need to reschedule, not necessarily or schedule a consultation, because I needed to get some more information. I needed to either review the IEP, look at the multidisciplinary report, speak to the medical provider who's treating the patient, and kind of try to understand more of that background information. And so I set up another time where we can meet and discuss kind of those outcomes. Because I think navigating it for each case is so individual. Now, if it is just those, like for the workshops, you can actually go online, any family can go online and sign up. So any family can come and say, I want to, you know, navigating the IEP session, and normally I would say after those sessions, there is time for that question and answer. So a lot of families, which I do warn families, you know, we are on Zoom and there's multiple families on there. They can ask me questions, but, you know, they're also kind of know that they're sharing all that information with more than just me. And sometimes after that, depending on the case, you know, we'll say, let's hold a different meeting, you know, let's have a consultation outside of this workshop. So that's kind of how I think the process is. So there is information through the Thompson Policy Institute on their website if they need to get a hold of me that way, or they can also go through the CHOC website. And
that's wonderful. Thank you, Elissa. And so for these consultations, are they time limited, or do families come back and receive ongoing consultations, for the annual and the triennial coming up, or, are they, continuing to receive consultations through FAST, or how does that process work?
So with that, it's truly individual. So I have families that I probably talk to every week, and we're really, working together. I'm talking to, actually just right before this, it's a case that I saw last week. I met with the school, we held the IEP today, and I'll meet with the family in a week. So there's some where I'm meeting on a weekly basis. There's some where it is just 30 minutes. So there's not necessarily a time limit, or, this is when it ends. There are families where it's like, I want you to review my IEP, and I review it and I provide them the input, and they'll say, can you attend? And I am very clear though, that I'm not an advocate, that I am there to kind of help the communication. And so I also tell school districts this, like, I'm not an advocate. I'm not trying to sue the district. I'm not trying to go after the district. But the one thing that I think that I've gotten from schools that it's been helpful for me is because I do have that administrative experience, I can also bring up, is this accommodation possible? But also support a family saying, that's not necessarily realistic for the school district, or that's not the school district's responsibility here. This is where you need to speak to our clinician. And so I bring in our, their psychologist and say, this psychologist can help build this, or, so I can also connect.
I think that that's so meaningful to have for our families. And, I'm just holding on to that quote that you included at the beginning of your talk from that parent, that they're the only one that has to live with the outcomes of the decisions that are made that day. So to have somebody there who is on your side, but also is essentially translating all of this jargon and different services and the breakdowns of, all these different classifications, I think can be so meaningful for families to have that ongoing support. So that's so wonderful to hear. In terms of FAST, I'm seeing several questions in the Q&A about how the service is funded. So can you tell us a little bit about the funding aspects of FAST, Elissa?
Yeah, so the Thompson Family Foundation, who made a donation to the Thompson Autism Center and are really, I'd say, involved in the Thompson Autism Center, are also donors to the Thompson Policy Institute over at Chapman University. And since their donation or their grant to the Thompson Policy Institute and creating that founded really essentially this program, is my program is funded partly through CHOC and then partly through a grant from the Thompson Family Foundation. So my service to our patients, it's not a fee. So it's not something insurance gets charged. It truly is a service that the Thompson family, and I'd say UCI Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorder, and I'd say Chapman University also have seen such a large benefit to their patients, to the overall community, that it is something that, they figure out the funding.
I know. I think that is, I'm just blown away to hear that. And so I think that that's just truly such a resource to offer to families at no cost. And, we've had so many conversations about disparities and service equity, and so to be able to offer this service at no cost to families is so great to know as a clinician, as a family member, and for all of our attendees. That's so great to hear. Before I transition to questions about Undivided, what are kind of the main takeaways for our family members, loved ones, clinicians? I know that's a wide range, but what are kind of the big takeaways for navigating the IEPs that are coming up in the next few months as we're nearing the end of this academic school year?
I think, really ask questions. So I think that communication P, and I think a lot of times communication can get lost in translation. A lot of times communication can be misunderstood through emails. And also when like a family member, and I feel like I deal with a lot of families where they walk away from a meeting with kind of a, not necessarily understanding or feeling like you didn't answer my question. And so sometimes it's kind of trying to jot down your questions beforehand, whether it's, I always suggest, I mean, most parents have their phones on them. And even in the middle of the night, if you wake up, quickly have a pad where you write them down. And then send that email beforehand. So if there are pieces where you're like, I'm really confused about this, I don't understand it. The other pieces I say data is really think in, and maybe it's because I come from a school background and we were always big on that data, and I want to see the progress on goals, and I want to see the data that, but really trying to look at it in those observable terms. So going back and thinking, versus, for example, trying to express what they're seeing with their child, versus saying my child's throwing a tantrum. Tantrum to me is throwing yourself on the ground, screaming and kind of kicking. Now that may not be what the tantrum is. So trying to make it to where it's observable to others. And I'd also say articulate the concerns, but in addition, really try to find those strengths, because I know as a parent and as teachers navigating through the pandemic and everything can be frustrated and heightened, but really try to think about the individual strengths and focus. Yes, there's going to be weaknesses, but what are the good things? What are the strengths? What can they do? You've got your concerns. And I feel like it's a lot of times it's easier for families to know those concerns, but focus on what can they do? How can we utilize the strengths to build it up? Unfortunately, the IEP process right now, or the IEP, I'd say document, not even necessarily the process, it's really a deficit-driven document. And so I think as much as the strengths can come out, and I think as a provider, you have to be clear and articulate the concerns, but also point out to the parents, like, what is good? A lot of times they don't really get what that good piece is. And I encourage families all the time when they're pulling their hair out about homework and those things. I'm like, speak to your case carrier. There's things that can be done. You also need to enjoy your child. There needs to be some enjoyment there. So I think that's kind of my, kind of working together and communicating and finding the individual strengths, because everybody's got them. They're all there.
Absolutely. And I think that there have also been many conversations about moving towards more strength-based language. It can be really hard for families to receive a dozen-page document or a report that just, quantifies all of the different ways that their child is struggling. And so, really being able to piece together what are those areas that the child does well, what are those relative strengths, so that way we can use those skills to promote those areas of deficit or challenges. And so I think, I love the title of your talk, Elissa. It does truly take a village. And also the village needs to know how to talk to each other and to coordinate all the many pieces. Great. So let's transition into talking about Undivided, which I was unfamiliar to until today. So exciting to be able to hear about the different ways that we're using digital mental health and digital health services. I think the main question about Undivided that's in the Q&A is it a paid subscription, or how can families and providers access Undivided?
So with Undivided, it is a paid subscription. So I think I'm not necessarily clear on their prices. And the only reason I say that is because we're running a pilot. And so the Thompson Family Foundation is actually paying for that pilot right now, to look at, can families in the medical community truly benefit from something like this? And so, and we really, our target for our pilot is those underserved population. And so it's those who can't necessarily afford something like this. I want to say it's around, depending on the subscription, there is a fee. I do believe they have a Facebook group, and those types. I want to say their events, some of their events are free and open to the public at no cost. They also do, so they've got kind of a tiered level. So they have something where you can the navigator, actually accessing the navigator is a higher price point versus just the various groups and the app subscription. And so the nice thing about the app subscription is you can upload the IEP document and they'll pull out kind of that relative information and that important information. I don't know if I answered the full question.
Great.
Sorry.
No, I think so. I think that, the main takeaway in terms of paid subscription, yes, the app does have a tiered model. As of right now, it is under a pilot. So for other attendees, that's when it's in a research phase, typically it might be free or at a reduced cost, but then really looking into the different tiers for the subscriptions. Another question that we're seeing in the Q&A is are these services available to families who are outside of the Orange County area?
So for FAST, if families wanted to reach out to me directly, and I can even put, or I think my email contact information, yes, if they wanted to do that. Regarding Undivided, I do know that they're doing a 30-day free trial for families. And so they do like an All About Me event and some nice pieces that even if you do the free trial and you just take a little bit away, you still kind of have some documents that you can do. For Undivided, I believe they're moving throughout the state of California and they're looking at expanding outside of the state. I don't know if their plan is yet to move outside of that phase, but it will be, yes.
Excellent. That's great. I think here in California, we have so many different components with our different STLPAs and school districts and all of those things. And so, for families who are here in California, I think that that's a great resource to start off with.
Yeah.
Well, what other kinds of takeaways do you have for Undivided for our families and attendees who are in the audience? We kind of had those main points for navigating the IEP and FAST, but what are some takeaways for Undivided?
The one piece that I do really, and for me, I think what got me for Undivided and really supported, let's pilot this, is that medical component of that documenting of medication changes and knowing the side effects, because I feel like I can't pronounce half of the medication unless they, unless it's their, it's the brand that everybody knows, but the generic brands I can't pronounce. But knowing that this is what they took and here's the side effects that they had. And so if your child does not necessarily stick with the same doctors as most providers, that information is readily available. So a lot of times for patients coming into our center and they're working with our neurologist, the neurologist is looking at prescribing, but they don't necessarily know if they've had negative side effects on some pieces. The other piece is navigating some of those resources as well as insurance. And so insurance can be a complex thing as is, and I've seen a huge benefit for our families in navigating that. I'd also say is that everybody's got access to the same documents. And one of the personal sides that they do is they talk to parents like, what do you want for their, as your outcome? Not necessarily looking at academic, not necessarily looking at health, but what do you want to be able to do with them? And I think one of the most touching ones that I heard about was like, I want to go on a hike, and so it's looking at just those natural things that we get enjoyment out of and sometimes take for granted. And then it's looking at, okay, we need regional center support for this. I do know that Undivided is working with various partners in regional center and that type of stuff to see how can more families have access to it at not that high cost. I don't believe it's there yet. But I do know if the family's a regional center client, that kind of is in the works and looking at how to be able to support them. So I think, a place where they can access things is what I've loved about it.
Great. Well, thank you so much again, Elissa, for being here with all of us this morning and presenting on your work through FAST and Undivided. I think we've all had some wonderful takeaways and resources that we can share with other professionals and families that we work with. One quick housekeeping thing for our attendees. We have our evaluation in the chat. So please, before you leave today or at your earliest convenience, fill out that evaluation for our wonderful speaker today. And with that, I'm seeing lots of thank yous in the chat. So thank you from all of us here in the Tarjan community, Elissa, for presenting your wonderful work and for being such a wonderful resource to us. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye.